Hi again. This is not usually a lecture class. This is a class that is really student driven. You pick most of what you read, as you have already seen if you watched my syllabus lecture. But I just thought that having a discussion about why reading matters and when reading matters can help get you primed to begin our first discussion board as a class. This is a talk I first gave, a shorter version of a talk I first gave at the Museum of Science and History. What does the word reading make you think of? Do you have a positive association with reading, a negative association, or mixed feelings? This is something that you might write about in your introductions to the class. You can think about something that was a particularly enjoyable experience for you or something that was particularly unenjoyable. Usually, when I ask this as a question, um, students will say that something that they loved reading is something that they found on their own, and something that was unenjoyable to them was something that they were forced to read and they really had to plow through to get it done. And so that's something that we're going to think about in this class. The institutional structures that can introduce you to reading and help you figure out what you like and what you're going to love, but also how they can be too sterilized or forceful or focused on testing and extinguish that love of reading in the process. Reading can be celebrated. I'm guessing that you've all seen posters like this one, Your Brain on Books, that tell us all of the great things that come from reading. That sort of great data about how important reading is comes up all of the time in Read Aside, the book that we're starting to read together as a class. Some of our readings, just in general, especially if you're a parent, you're constantly going to be told about why reading is important. But reading historically can also be feared, and we don't usually talk about this aspect of it as much. It's equally important. This is a picture of Nat Turner and a picture of Nat Turner's Bible that's at the National Museum of African American History, which I saw in January a few years ago. There was actually a law written, as I hope you know, that made it illegal to teach slaves to read after Nat Turner's rebellion. I'm actually looking to see if I happen to have the graphic novel. I think it's in my office at work, of Nat Turner's story. It's a really good graphic novel by Kyle Baker. This was an act to prevent all persons from teaching slaves to read or write, the use of figures accepted. Whereas teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction in their minds, like it's reading's fault and not the institution of slavery's fault, and to produce insurrection and rebellion to the manifest injury of citizens of the state. Therefore, be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of North Carolina, and it is hereby enacted by authority of the same, that any free person who shall hereafter teach or attempt to teach any slave within the state to read or write, the use of figures accepted, or shall give or sell to such slave or slaves any books or pamphlets, shall be liable to indictment in any court of record in the state having jurisdiction thereof, and upon conviction shall at the discretion of the court, if white, be fined not less than $100 or imprisoned, and if a free person of color shall be fined, imprisoned, or whipped at the discretion of the court. So first of all, you see the race-based different legal systems whipping even written into law for free Black Americans. But in the wake of Nat Turner's rebellion, there was fear among people, white people who were in power, that reading could cause social unrest. That kind of fear of causing dissatisfaction in the minds of enslaved people is not the only reason why people feared writing. There were also fears about women writing or women reading. Even other women writers like Anna Seward and Mary Wollstonecraft criticized the effects of novel reading on women's minds. So there was a long time when writers and intellectuals thought that if you read the wrong thing, especially if you're a woman, you might become lascivious or deranged. Even now, books can be banned. So the top 10 banned and challenged books from to 2009. I'm sure there's a more updated version, but I picked this one because the top one is Harry Potter. It's something that most of you have probably heard of, if only because of J.K. Rowling's recent and deeply unfortunate transphobia. But I'm guessing that most of you have heard of many of these books. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Perks of Being a Wallflower. Anytime a book is banned, it's because of fear. That fear can be for different reasons: white supremacy, misogyny, a fear of losing control. But that fear also shapes the culture of reading. Reading can be transformational. Laws or social mores that try to suppress reading often make it even more appealing and important. So books are banned. We have banned books week, and we're like, yay, like librarians are telling us read banned books. It can make it more fun and exciting. Just thinking back to the history that I was invoking with Nat Turner's Rebellion, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper wrote a really great poem, Learning to Read, in 1872. It's a fictional poem. She was born free, but she writes it from the perspective of an enslaved person who was allowed to read after emancipation. Very soon the Yankee teachers came down and set up school, but oh, how the Rebs did hate it. Twas against their rule. Our masters always tried to hide book learning from our eyes. Knowledge didn't agree with slavery, 'twould make us all too wise. But some of us would try to steal a little from the book and put the words together and learn by hook or crook. The poem goes on, but you can see the revelatory joy of being allowed to read and recognizing why reading was suppressed to begin with. Richard Wright writes about how reading was suppressed for Black people during the Jim Crow era in The Library Card, which is a short little vignette from his autobiography. He was not allowed to enter libraries as a Black man unless he was running an errand. And so he found a way. He found someone who let him borrow his library card and gave a note that said the books that he was picking up for himself were actually for this white person. He picked a white Catholic because he figured that the Catholic would feel as out of place in society, a little bit, mostly Presbyterian, or yeah, no, mostly Protestant society, encountering Presbyterian, but other denominations, and might understand a little bit what it was like to want to read and access a library. Wright writes, I forged more notes and my trips to the library became frequent. Reading grew into a passion. I read Dreiser's Jenny Gerhardt and Sister Carrie, and they revived in me a vivid sense of my mother's suffering. I was overwhelmed. I grew silent, wondering about the life around me. It would have been impossible for me to have told anyone what I derived from these novels, for it was nothing less than a sense of life itself. So being able to read, after not being allowed to read, completely changes Wright's life, and he goes on to become one of the most important writers in American literary history. There are sociological examples as well. Today we're reading about Neil Gaiman talking about why our future depends on libraries, reading, and daydreaming. He says, I was once in New York, and I listened to a talk about the building of private prisons, a huge growth industry in America. The prison industry needs to plan its future growth. How many cells are they going to need? How many prisoners are there going to be 15 years from now? And they found they could predict it very easily using a pretty simple algorithm based on asking what percentage of 10 and 11-year-olds couldn't read. So Gaiman brings up, his essay, as you'll see, is not all about prisons, but he brings up this correlation between the inability to read and incarceration. On the flip side of that, we're also reading a piece that's about how assigning reading groups instead of prison time, even for violent offenders, lowers their likelihood of reoffending. So what's going on there? We see this for people who have been incarcerated. The more reading that people do when they're incarcerated reduces their reoffending, and it helps them reconnect with their family, create a sense of a self-actualized life in a different way. Why? What's going on there? Do these examples imply that reading is always a social or individual good? They definitely tell us that something good can happen when reading, at least under specific circumstances. But that question can be complicated. Does it matter what you read? Does it matter when you read it? Laws or social mores that try to suppress reading often make it even more appealing and important. So reading when you're incarcerated You're being dehumanized in every way, and reading is all about connecting with other people and finding your own humanity in that link to characters if you're reading fiction, or to other people if you're reading, memoir and biography. Reading humanizes and fights that dehumanization. That's just one of the ways that the suppression of some rights makes reading even more important. But the overemphasis on certain kinds of reading can have the opposite effect. So, just a few quick examples that we're not reading for the class, but you might be interested in. Boarding school blues. Native people were forced into boarding schools that tried to get rid of any of their native traditions and teach them to value white culture. This, like the law that prohibited slaves from reading, was all about suppressing any sort of difference and trying to enforce white supremacist ideals of what counted as literature. The Miseducation of the Negro is a really important book about um, kind of after that learning to read moment, that poem that we read about when Black students were taught a white canon. They were taught that the modern world started in Greece and Rome, when there was even more ancient architecture and literature in Ethiopia and Egypt. So The Miseducation of the Negro was written, I think, in 1935, if I remember correctly, about how when you're only teaching about white culture and these Eurocentric ideals, you're really teaching students to internalize racism. And The Hunger of Memory is a beautiful memoir by Richard Rodriguez, where he writes about how great it looked to get a PhD in English when he was an immigrant who grew up speaking Spanish in his house, but he really thinks through how getting that education changed his relationship to his family and his culture. And it's not all good or all bad. In Rodriguez's case, he's glad he got his PhD. It gives him perspective, but he understands that he lost something and didn't just gain something. Those are just a few examples. There's a lot more out there on this topic, obviously. Reading, of course, can also be boring or stressful. I'm guessing that's something that you've experienced. We're going to be reading about it in Readicide. Readicide is the systematic killing of the love of reading, often exacerbated by inane, mind-numbing practices found in schools. So if you have to write a 10-page essay about every paragraph that you read, you're going to start reading just thinking about what you're going to write about and not reading to actually get into the book. So brainstorming, and these are questions that you could think about throughout the course of the semester. Like I said, this is not a lecture class, so this is just a one-time thing. I leave these questions with you as you go forward. Why do you think that reading might lower recidivism rates and correlate to incarceration rates? Why and to whom does reading matter? Do certain kinds of reading matter more than other kinds? So does reading a text from a friend matter as much as reading a novel? Does reading a blog or a tweet matter as much as reading a math textbook? Why? What can we do to help fight against Readicide? These are all questions that we could delve into over the next 15 weeks together. And I hope that you enjoy asking these questions, and I look forward to seeing what you have to say. Thanks.